ask you the sort of big question I think everyone has is seen all the Trump moves, right? Zelensky to Denmark, towards Canada, um, questioning NATO. What is the European response? You live in London, live and breathe the European world. How are the Europeans perceiving all of this?
So I think in the last couple of months, it's been a kind of accelerated version of the stages of grief. Shock followed by anger, and I think acceptance that a relationship, a transatlantic relationship that has lasted for 80 years, under this administration is going to be fundamentally different because this administration has a different attitude towards its allies than its predecessors. This administration has a transactional view of the world, as we put on our cover a couple of weeks ago, a kind of mobster mafia view of the world, where you basically bully people who you can bully. And I think the Europeans are recognizing that. This has three, I think, big consequences. Firstly, because we rely so much on America, there is a move, particularly amongst the prime ministers and the heads of state, to try and keep the show on the road. Keir Starmer was here, Emmanuel Macron, trying to work with President Trump, flatter, cajole, to minimize the damage. But secondly, the Europeans are really finally, at last, realizing they need to spend a lot more on defense. And you saw the biggest transformation in Germany, where Friedrich Merz, the incoming chancellor, has basically agreed with his coalition partners a huge increase in defense spending. But I think the third consequence, which is only just beginning to become clear, is a recognition in Europe that if you can't rely on the US, and worse, if possibly it's hostile, Europe has to not just spend more on defense, but it has to think more autonomously. And this is a huge change for a Europe that has believed in the transatlantic alliance. So whether it is the Polish prime minister talking about nuclear weapons, whether it is the Portuguese now no longer wanting to buy F-35s, there is a sense of an autonomy needed in Europe. And actually, if things get worse, and we haven't got here yet, but if things get worse, I think Europe will start thinking in Trumpian terms. We'll start thinking about what assets does it bring to the table and what is its leverage. So it's been an unbelievably tumultuous 6 weeks.
What do you think this does for allies in Asia who look at this and think, well, if the Americans can discard their closest allies, the Europeans, are we, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians secure? The former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turner is saying, we're never going to get these subs. We should go back to the French. The Americans are not reliable.
So everything Zanny just said, I agree with, but I think it applies to Europe. So you look at other countries around the world, Canada and Mexico, it's a big fight right now, but ultimately they have nowhere to go. And I would expect that USMCA will get back together over the course of 2025, 2026. The Middle East, Gulf states, Israel, they prefer Trump to the Biden administration. No problem there at all. The Asian states, I mean, you look at someone like Ishiba in Japan and a recognition that even though he is weak, he nonetheless had a pretty good meeting with Trump. So did Modi. These are countries that know that the U.S.-China relationship is bad and that it's not as dramatic, it is not as unprecedented, it's not as permanent as what the Americans are doing to Europe. I think the Europeans uniquely are facing what's going to be permanent damage because they're being hit on trade, they're being hit on Russia, which is their top adversary, and they're being hit on their own democracies. Trump administration is saying, no, we think you're the enemy. We're not doing that to Japan or South Korea. So it is very different with Europe right now.
Do you think the Europeans could do the ultimate thing, which is the only place that can challenge the dollar's dominance in the world economy would be the euro? If they were to do serious euro bonds that would effectively rival the dollar's treasury bills, is that possible?
Look, I think it's possible eventually. I think we shouldn't exaggerate how quickly reserve currencies take a very long time to shift. And I'm not for a second thinking that the US is about to lose its position as the world's reserve currency. But I do think that if Europe uses this opportunity of the increased defense spending to create more joint assets, to develop a European capital market, which is hugely needed, and also to use this process to kickstart the economic reform that Europe desperately needs. I mean, I've been on this show before talking about how awful Europe, how feeble it is at reform. If it does all of that, it could be much, much stronger than it currently is. And so I think there's a huge benefit to Europe amongst this.
Stay with us. When we come back, we're going to talk about Russia and Ukraine, and will a ceasefire actually break out?